I have always believed that movies and animated shows are more than just a form of entertainment. Whether they be box office hits or underrated nostalgic classics, good cinema or good entertainment moves us. It enlightens us and allows us to process a rush of emotions that we don't usually experience in our everyday mundane lives. It allows us to release our emotions, both the good and the bad. They make us laugh, they make us cry, and most importantly, they make us think. By simplifying life lessons down to their basic elements for anyone of any age or culture to understand and eventually comprehend, like modern day parables or timeless fables, they can help teach us valuable life lessons. They will never be able to answer the why questions we ask about life and death, but they do help us to eventually come to our own conclusions by showing us characters going through similar and often exaggerated situations and coming out the other side. Some movies make attempts to touch on heavier themes while also trying to avoid insulting the audience's intelligence. This, I think, is something very few movies manage to achieve, especially those made suitable for children. And it's an even rarer thing in today's cinema, which tends to focus more on parody, pop culture reference jokes, or innuendo humor in a seriously lame-ass attempt to make some sort of inauthentic connection to its audience. To me, this sort of humor does have its place for sure, but I do not believe it should be assumed that this is the only way you can successfully form a connection with your audience when targeting a wide age range. Don Bluth, to me, is not only a master animator and director, but he is also a master at the melancholy. Most of his work has a very grim atmosphere about it and has a feeling of dread throughout the runtime. In spite of his movies being less than 40 years old at the time of making this video, his films have an old soul quality to them. Secret of NIMH especially has a very Watership Down kind of vibe, almost even similar to Plague Dogs now that I think about it, which was released in the same year. I think this is in part to the art that inspires the production art as well as the backgrounds used in these films. The studio Sullivan Bluth Studios had the explicit goal in mind of returning feature animation to its golden era, concentrating on strong characters and story, experimenting with unusual and often more labor-intensive animation techniques, because they believed the older techniques were being abandoned in favor of lower production costs, and the only way that animation could survive was to continue traditional production methods. Though I feel that Don Bluth's reluctance to accept and adapt to the advancements of technology ended up being his downfall. Considering the state of the animation industry in the 80s, though, I can't help but see where he was coming from, even going for an illustrative style that feels far more Tolkien in nature, which makes sense since the artists behind the initial production poster for Don Bluth's first theatrical film, The Secret of NIMH, were the same guys that illustrated the Lord of the Rings calendar illustrations. The brothers Hildebrandt, known as Tim and Greg Hildebrandt, work is world-renowned. They are known for illustrating the covers for the magazine Heavy Metal, the album cover for Black Sabbath's Mob Rules, Magic the Gathering. I think they've done some Dungeons and Dragons stuff as well. They've worked for Marvel and DC, I think, as well as some of their own fan art of Disney movies. But they are probably most famous for creating the very first production poster for the first Star Wars movie. Well, at least the UK version of it. I think the American production posters for the film was done by Drew Struzan, although I think I could be wrong about that. Maybe someone could correct me in the comments below. The backgrounds in The Secret of NIMH were created by an artist called Ron Diaz, or Dias. How do you say that name? I don't know. Who also created art in Ralph Banksy's Lord of the Rings animated movie, as well as the Toontown sequence in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. That's pretty cool. To achieve the film's detailed, full animation while keeping to the tight budget, the studio strove to keep any waste of time and resources to a minimum. Having voice actors who added to the movie's philosophical texture was a must. I don't usually talk about the voice acting too much in these videos as it's not really my area of expertise, but I really feel like it should be touched upon. Elizabeth Hartman voiced Mrs. Brisby, who sadly committed suicide in 1987. Brisby's own first name was never revealed in the movie or in the book, but fans of the book and the movie named her Elizabeth after the late voice actor. That's really cool. The lead character's name was changed from Mrs. Frisbee in the novel to Mrs. Brisby in the movie to avoid legal entanglements from the Wham-O company, makers of the Frisbee. Unfortunately, this change came late in the film's production, long after the actors had recorded their dialogue. and because it wasn't feasible to have each and every actor using the word frisbee in the movie re-record their lines, the change from frisbee to brisbee was actually made by the sound editors who, by hand, carefully sliced the BR noise syllable taken from other words spoken by the actors into the FR on the magnetic dialogue tracks. Guys, this was done when everything was done by analog. Digital wasn't a thing yet. Can you imagine what a pain in the arse this must have been to edit? And here's me thinking video editing for YouTube videos was a headache. Oh, also, hey, did you know Martin was voiced by Will Wheaton, otherwise known as Wesley Crusher from Star Trek Next Generation? As a Trekkie, this made me super happy. Let's remember this fact more than Eric Idle, who voices him in the sequel, which we aren't discussing in this video whatsoever. Peter Strauss was the voice of Justin, who also voiced Stoker in Biker Mice from Mars. I don't know, I just think this was kind of cool, because it's rats and mice. Does anyone actually remember that show? Just me? Okay. Jeremy is a character that I find really annoying. I mean, even Brisby herself tries to make him leave her alone at one point. He wasn't as prominent a character in the book, other than taking Brisby to see the owl. Yeah, Jeremy just overstayed his welcome. As much as I love Dom DeLuise's work, Jeremy is annoying. The Secret of NIMH to me is an animated movie that treats its audience like adults. It's a well-told dark fantasy science fiction film that respects its audience enough not to tone down the subject matter. I feel that a younger viewer doesn't really need to have a young character to connect with or identify with all the time, though admittedly the movie may feel a little littered with too many characters. I do think that Brisby herself is a strong leading character in spite of her timidity. When we think mother figure characters in animated movies and TV shows, they are either ridiculously tragic, over-the-top villainous, or just never mentioned. Either that, or they're given very minor parts, reduced to side characters. Or they are put on a pedestal seen as this perfect, almost saint-like character that is mentioned by name only. They are also often relegated to be secondary characters with relatively few adventures of their own. It's very rare for mothers to be fleshed out characters in animated movies and TV shows, but the best example I can think of, recently anyway, was Incredibles 2, but even then, the fact she was a mother was not pushed to the forefront as much, other than a few jokes about balancing being a superhero with being a mother. I highly suggest if you want to see a movie that focuses more on motherhood, watch Wolf Children. That film is amazing. Motherhood is the main motivation for Brisby. Instead of having a wisecracking heroic warrior for the main character, we instead have a frightened mother who faces certain danger to save the life of her son who is gravely ill. Her fear is our fear, but her bravery gives us the courage to stay with her and face the danger. The film has a sophisticated feel to it that few animated movies at the time, or since, really, now that I think about it, had. Yeah, you had The Last Unicorn and Plague Dogs released the same year, which did have their own level of sophistication, but not nearly as memorable, at least not to me. I remember writing a book report about Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH back in high school, having no clue there was in fact an animated movie based on the book. I'm not going to get hung up on how inaccurate the movie is in comparison to the book, other than saying the fantastical elements were added more for cinematic reasons than anything else. It gave Don Bluth an excuse to be more experimental with the animation, but a part of me does also suspect that this may have been done purely for that reason and not to actually add anything to the story. When approaching a movie like The Secret of NIMH, which on the surface does look like another juvenile oversimplified movie that is made suitable for adults and children alike, this movie in my opinion manages to touch very heavy themes like mental health and grief, while also remaining vague enough to leave the movie's meaning and intent open to interpretation. The Secret of NIMH for many reasons can be a heavy movie to process and, yeah, difficult to write about, especially if you're going through incredibly difficult times like I am. At the same time though, having a movie that does this helps you to understand difficult situations better and can allow you a pressure release or a moment of enlightenment. To me, The Secret of NIMH is one of these movies. After all, many animated movies have a terrible habit of resorting to the Care Bear trope when it comes to dealing with death or grief. Say a character dies and they are suddenly brought back to life for no explanation whatsoever. In my opinion though, things have improved in that regard. Movies like The Lion King or Big Hero 6 for instance deal with grief in very different ways, one far more symbolic than the other I suppose, but to me, the moment that Brisby learns exactly how her husband Jonathan died was dealt tastefully and realistically. I may be reading way too much into this and looking way too deep, but just because the movie may not have intended for these themes to be so prominent, doesn't mean they can't still come from it anyway. An artist's initial message or meaning behind the piece should not dictate you to have the same interpretation. It doesn't make it wrong, it's simply a different interpretation, and that's okay. There was no magic stone in the book, but I do feel that perhaps the magical stone itself was meant to either represent Jonathan's spirit or soul, or Brisby's inner strength, and that it was important for this version of the story to have Brisby save her children herself with the help of the magic stone instead of the rats. The fact that touching the stone hurts or burns her may be a representation of how much death stings and burns when we lose a loved one. I think the main problem with the movie and the book is the fact that all the animals talk and behave intelligently from the beginning of the story. This does detract from the spectacular development of the Rats of NIMH a little bit, but is mildly frustrating really. At its core, this movie is obviously a three-way battle between science versus nature and the unknown. Bluth himself would later make several changes to the story, most notably with the addition of mystical elements that, as I said before, were not in the book. Regarding magic, we really believe that animation calls for some magic to give it a special fantastic quality. The stone or amulet is just a method of letting the audience know that Mrs. Brisby has found courage of the heart. In the same vein, Nicodemus was made into a wizard to create more mystery about himself and the rats colony. The nature is the choices that they make in how to use the science and electricity. What is the most responsible and ethical way to use them? It's also the natural instincts to preserve and protect our loved ones no matter the cost. The unknown is the unexplained magical elements within the story, the stone and the magic it holds, and how Brisby uses it to save her children in the end. Yeah, it is seen as a deus ex machina, but I think that was literally the point. The stone represents the circumstances that can't be explained. The fact that this is something that humanity will always struggle with and be frustrated about. Mrs. Brisby gets burned by the stone, but she still holds on to it and uses it, representing how we treat the unknown. The stone itself is never explained, you know, we don't know who created it, where it came from, how it works, why it works, or what it is, but I think that's the whole point. The 1980s seemed to favour the darker side of storytelling with very little sugarcoating. It felt like a time where children's media had a level of respect for what they could handle and very rarely pandered. Fantasy drama such as this one, of such high quality, is something to treasure and should not be kept secret. I'm Mad Munchkin, stay creative. Thanks for watching this video, guys. This was brought to you by my Patreon supporters. A huge thank you to my top supporters on Patreon. This includes OLD, Seeker, Sanji DK, James the Brony, Steve Decker, Transformer Brett, Invisible Gust or Picademus, CT Stormwing, CT0798, Mayan Jinx, Tristan N. Milner, Patronators, Kickit6, Alex Hunter, Brongar Unknown 620, Charles Meeker, Kyle Christensen, Seth Richards, Aces Wild, Mystic Mind, J-Rog 1989, Amy Snow, Rocky Harmony, and Pedro Lopez. Thank you once again to everyone that supports me on Patreon, and if you want to support me, there is a link in the description below, and the top supporters will get to join my Discord server, just amongst other things as well. You can tell this part is unscripted, can't you? Well, anyway guys, thanks for watching the video. I'm Mad Munchkin, stay creative.